and thanks to the CEP, thanks to Hans as well, and I'm delighted that we're being joined today by such a large and distinguished audience and group of participants. So it's very good to be here. Let me first of all, moving, you can see the sort of the structure of the presentation. I'll just give a few words on the monitoring team. I'll talk about the way the threat has been evolving, some regional points, and then one or two thoughts on what we might expect to see transpire in the near future. So on the monitoring team, and I'm very aware that there are many other people on this who are present who know the monitoring team, so I hope I'm getting this right. I'll just quickly take you through the stages of evolution of the monitoring team and what it does. So that's the next slide, please, Alexander. And the monitoring team, in common with many other UN bodies or subordinate bodies, has been formed through sort of evolution through resolutions, through Security Council resolutions. We were originally established in 2004, and that was to support the committee that was responsible for sanctions on the Taliban and al-Qaeda, and that itself had been established in 1999 by Resolution 1267. So that was the sort of the founding resolution of the sanctions regime that we serve. And then the various iterations, as I say, the monitoring team itself came into being 5 years later, 2004. Another 7 years passed, and then there were resolutions to separate the sanctions committee for ISIL from the sanctions committee for the Taliban from the sanctions committee for al-Qaeda. That was in 2011, and then another 4 years until ISIL had emerged as the dominant concern in terms of terrorist groups. And that was added to the al-Qaeda committee in 2015 by Resolution 2253. So that's the sort of the brief history of our evolution. We comprise 10 experts from 10 different member states, and we're based in New York. And we support the committees, which are known as 1267 and 1988, because 1267 being the founding resolution for the al-Qaeda sanctions regime, and then because the Taliban was separated in 2011 as an Afghan issue, an issue for some future Afghan peace process, which of course is very timely now, the resolution which did that, 1988, became the sort of the one that by which we refer to the Taliban Sanctions Committee 1988. What we do, we assess the global threat from ISIL and al-Qaeda in biannual reports, of which the last one was the 25th, which was submitted to the committee at the end of 2019 and was published online at the end of January 2020. And we also give regular oral briefings to the committee. We draft the threat part of the UN Secretary General's regular report on ISIL, and we give a lot of other ad hoc briefings to UN bodies. And in addition, once a year, we report on the Taliban threat to peace and stability in Afghanistan, and that falls due at the end of April. So you will check your watches, you'll see that we are just wrestling with that right now. We also, apart from from these reporting obligations and the threat assessment, of course, we have this fundamental responsibility for the sanctions lists. And so it is our job to collect information from member states on individuals and entities on both lists to keep them accurate, relevant, fit for purpose, to maximize their impact. This includes also making sure that we remove names from the list if those names should no longer be on, sometimes because the sanctions have achieved their objective of behaviour change, and an individual no longer merits listing. Or sometimes, of course, in some cases, it happens because individuals are deceased and are subsequently removed from the sanctions lists. We have some sort of lesser but nevertheless significant tasks. One of the things that we do in the context of the reports is that we prepare and present recommendations to make the 3 sanctions measures, the asset freeze, the travel ban, the arms embargo, more effective. And these are often picked up and used by the Security Council when it is drafting new resolutions. So they become quite influential. They're often, as it were, feedstock for new UN resolutions. We aim to improve implementation and member state compliance. Now, of course, to do all of this work, we have to liaise with member states' counterterrorism agencies. And for that purpose, we are uniquely in the UN specifically mandated to work with member states' intelligence and security and other special services concerned with counterterrorism. Obviously, that's where a lot of the relevant information, both for the threat assessment and for the sanctions list, resides. Another task that we have increasingly developed over time, and where we are working partly to support the wider UN objective of enhancing international counterterrorism cooperation, we organise regional meetings, bring together counterterrorism agencies, seniors from certain regions together, we find those very effective for a number of reasons, but they do have this very desirable effect of generating new liaisons between services who, perhaps surprisingly, are not always talking to each other before we bring them together. We work on this global mandate primarily with counterterrorism agencies, as I say, but also more broadly with the departments, ministries, agencies of member states. And that can also include a whole range of other people concerned with counterterrorism, whether it's customs, whether it's financial intelligence units, whether it's border control, a whole range of the wider participants in the CT effort. And we also work with very closely within the UN with our UN colleagues, the many UN agencies which are concerned with counterterrorism under the overall coordination of the UN Office of Counterterrorism. That is also a very, very important part of what we do, because our threat assessment is very important to the other UN agencies' understanding of how to prioritize the work that they do to meet the threat, to help member states build capacity to meet that threat. We also work with a range of other relevant bodies, Interpol, International Civil Aviation Organization, World Customs Organization, Financial Action Task Force and its regional bodies, and also some representatives of relevant private sector industries. As you can imagine, finance looms quite large in that, but also some relevant non-financial businesses and professions. So that's broadly what we do and how we do it. I don't want to go on at any greater length on that, but of course you can always ask questions. Moving on to the next slide. So I'll just introduce some key events from roughly the last year. Many of them very well known to you, of course, but perhaps just worth restating in terms of their possible impact. Firstly, the military defeat of ISIL completed in eastern Syria in March 2019. The fall of Baghouz, of course, yielded a larger than expected movement of refugees and fighters. And this has led on to, of course, a new and very significant pressing preoccupation, which is all of the displaced people who are still stranded in Syria. And of course, the Al-Hol camp is a particular is in many ways is the most striking example and the most troubling example of an overcrowded and highly problematic camp, which needs to be addressed, because we simply can't leave people in limbo indefinitely. Second thing I'll mention is from the following month, April 2019, the largest international attack, recent international attack, was the Easter Sunday bombings in Sri Lanka. Thirdly, on al-Qaeda, in September, we learned that Hamza bin Laden had been killed some time previously. Bearing in mind that Ayman al-Zawahiri is in Afghanistan and in poor health, it is important now to analyse what direction al-Qaeda may take in the future, what direction Abu Muhammad al-Masri, the presumed successor of Zawahiri, would take al-Qaeda if he were to succeed. And there's an interesting geopolitical point, of course, here, which is how the Afghan peace process could affect that. My fourth point is around those geopolitical points, that a lot has happened recently to impact upon counterterrorism and upon the kind of interstices which allow terrorists to hide and regroup and seek to wreak havoc. I mentioned the Afghan peace process as a possible positive. I'll come back to that later. Military efforts to retake Idlib, which keep ratcheting up a sort of local tensions in northwestern Syria. Very, very difficult. It's a huge counterterrorism problem, but of course there's a huge issue of civilian protection as well, and great risks in terms of potential generation of new humanitarian and refugee concerns. Then there was last autumn Turkey's military initiative in northern Syria, which was another factor affecting some of these issues. There was the US killing of Qasem Soleimani a little bit later, at the beginning of this year, and I think the point I just want to make here is that some of the key participants in the counter-terrorist effort in the core zone, both ISIL core, but also in northwestern Syria, a very important node of al-Qaeda. This is complicated. You know, if you think of the United States, Iraq, Iran, Syria, Turkey, Russia, key international participants. And of course, anything that makes international cooperation amongst those partners more difficult is a source of concern. And then the last major event of 2019 in the ISIL core area was the killing of Baghdadi, of course, in late October. A few days later, Abu Ibrahim al-Hashimi al-Qurayshi was announced as his successor. And we're increasingly confident that Abu Ibrahim is identical with Amr Muhammad Said Abdullah Rahman al-Mawla, who was an established ISIL senior who previously served as Baghdadi's deputy. The last tier I have is the COVID-19 outbreak. I'll just mention that because the impact of that is uncertain at the moment. I don't want to speculate too much about it, although people are very interested in it, and there is a certain amount of noise being made by the terrorist groups and extremist groups about it. It's obviously challenging for governments, but I think it's also challenging for terrorists. It's been a relatively quiet period in terms of terrorist activity in some parts of the world recently, and that may be partly because of the relative unavailability of some of the more traditional targets that particularly inspired lone actors would naturally try to target. Moving to regional trends, and I'll try to accelerate because I think I've been slow. I've said Iraq and Syria are still the heartlands of ISIL, most likely venues for resurgence. Really important, I think, to stress that there is no sense in which the problem has moved away from Syria and Iraq. That is still the epicenter. Therefore, occasionally you hear people talk about, well, the problem was in Iraq and Syria, and now it's moved to Afghanistan. And I want to stress that that is a very misleading way of reading this. It doesn't move in that way, and nor do you solve a profound counterterrorism problem purely with the military success that was achieved in Iraq and Syria. So there's much more work to be done. ISIL legacy challenges, yes, I mentioned al-Hol camp, I mentioned the fact that there are a lot of foreign terrorist fighters still, they're sort of immediate fate unresolved. And of course I mentioned northwest Syria, where you have these affiliates of al-Qaeda active and very concerning. Afghanistan is the remote province away from the core zone, which perhaps gives most concern. And as I say, the Afghan peace process is really important in this. ISIL Khorasan has taken quite a beating recently, but there are an awful lot of foreign terrorist fighters, extremist elements, just pockets of insurgents and bandits in Afghanistan. It's going to be a very complicated process to restore some form of law and order to Afghanistan, assuming that the peace process is successful. And of course, we must do everything we can to work for it to be successful. I'll just quickly mention West Africa and the Sahel as another region which is giving growing concern to member states because of the success of both the al-Qaeda and the ISIL franchises there in shaking the stability of the regional member states. And you can see this as a deliberate policy that they've been pursuing, and it's most strikingly visible in Burkina Faso, but you can feel the contagion increasingly dangerous to some of the bordering states. I won't get into any of those other arenas that I've listed. I just wanted to sort of tip my hat and say, you know, I recognize that there are so many other arenas of concern, and of course we can come to those when questions are asked. But those are a few that I've listed there. And I just want to finish on the sort of the present scenario by saying that ISIL still, having folded its external operations capability as part of its survival strategy under fire during the military campaign, it still has not been successful in re-establishing that external operations capability. And so all of the dynamism of terrorist activity tends to be within these conflict zones. And ISIL's ability to direct complex international attacks, for example, into Europe or into the United States or indeed elsewhere, is at the moment almost non-existent. And of course, there's another reason why at the time of COVID-19, it's very challenging for the terrorists because they're so reliant on inspired attacks. And inspired attacks tend to be small scale, and there isn't very much of that happening at the moment. What next? I'll try and run through this very, very quickly and see if people are interested in picking any of it up. Foreign terrorist fighters, huge issue. Maybe 25,000 plus still alive. Some have returned, some are still in transit, some have more deliberately relocated, some are in prison in various locations, many of them still in the conflict zone, of course, some of them still active in the conflict zone, and others in detention or in limbo of some sort in the conflict zone. This is a big issue, really big issue for the future. It's if you think about Afghanistan and al-Qaeda circa 2002, and think of the problems that we had from returnees, relocators, etc. After that, this is that problem, but very much multiplied in scale. And the issue of dependence. You know, there are different related challenges of, you have obviously you have women activists, women fighters. You also have female dependents. you have children who have, minors who have special rights, need to be treated differently. There are legal obligations in terms of how you handle minors. But of course, in present circumstances, many of these coming out of the so-called caliphate were already had been exposed to extreme violence. Those who are in al-Hal camp are not in the most promising of environments for normalization of their lives. So there is this incubating problem, and the international community, I think, needs to get out on the front foot on this. I always mention this Indonesian foreign terrorist fighter who was killed in Syria in 2018, and his father was one of the Bali bombers, and the child was about 5 years old at the time that his father carried out that attack. It's a reminder that this is a generational challenge. It will come back to haunt us if we don't address it successfully. ISIL and al-Qaeda, sometimes we need to wonder, how meaningful these distinctions will be in the future. Certainly in some of the regions, there's more collaboration between the affiliates, for example, in West Africa and the Sahel, whereas in other places like Yemen and Somalia, they're at each other's throats and sort of deadly enemies. I think we have to anticipate that there will be a fluidity about takfiri terrorism in the future. There are the succession issues. What difference will al-Mawla make to ISIL? Probably he won't make major strategic changes, but of course he has to react to the various challenges that he faces in his era. And of course, there's the al-Qaeda potential succession that I mentioned earlier. Who knows, then we may see the emergence of new brands as well. So I think there's going to be a complexity about the threat picture, which is going to be a challenge for the international community and for counterterrorism agencies. We should certainly expect more in the way of inspired attacks rather than directed attacks in the near future. But obviously we very much hope that we won't see anything on the scale of the Easter Sunday attacks in Sri Lanka last year. But sooner or later we will face a reconstituted external operational capability. Most likely ISIL, but of course it could be somebody else. I think most likely in Iraq or Syria, but again, it could be somewhere else. COVID-19 effect, just a couple of thoughts there. The propaganda on this is pretty nonsensical. I mean, of course, there's a lot of chatter, endless chatter that you get about it being a soldier of God. People have wondered about whether it could be a biological weapon, but we've not seen any sign of that. We've even seen sign of concerns in the groups about, how do they keep their people safe from it? Because of course the idea that it only affects people who are, who are sinners or unbelievers or whatever, that doesn't stand the light of day for very long. So it's distracting the terrorists as well. It's making it difficult for them to travel, and it's removing the potential targets they might attack. So this is interesting to watch over time. The CT community, I think all of us are aware that we've been somewhat fortunate because the early period of COVID-19 has been very, very distracting for all, I think, official bureaucracies. People have taken time to get themselves fully functional remotely, and remotely there are some limitations on what you can do. So defences are probably weaker than they would normally be. So if it were possible for the terrorists to generate a major attack, like any other major challenge to government, like an extreme weather event or something of the sort, that would be very challenging in present circumstances. And I think I've run over my time and I should stop. Thank you.